Great. I think 25 participants is a good threshold. It's 5 minutes past the hour. This would be a good time for us to start. So thank you everyone for joining us today in our first expert talk of the year. How can we innovate in refugee engagement and education? M-Shule is holding today's session in collaboration with the Xavier Project and OSUN Open Society University Network. My name is Phoebe Khagame, Head of Operations, and one of the panelists today. Before we continue, I would like to go over the house rules. One, please mute your mic when you're not speaking. Two, as we go through the session, please send in your questions on the chat. And as I have mentioned, include your name, the organization you're with, just in case. And yes, and keep track of all the questions. Again, yes, thank you for the suggestion, Mick. You may rename, you can rename yourself even as we proceed with the session. We will keep track of all the questions and lead with them during the Q&A session. We will be recording this session as well as additional information and details, which we will pass on to you at the end of the meeting. I hope that is in order. And to start us off, I will request my colleague Claire to share with us the opening remarks from UNHCR, and then we will kick off the meeting. Claire?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Strecker. I'm the Connected Education Officer at UNHCR, and I've worked with organizations like Xavier and M-Shule over the last couple of years to emphasize how important it is to localize the application of EdTech resources in the field and in different contexts. What we've seen is often people assume that the application of technology within a context is going to be similar, no matter what environment you're implementing those resources in. And we simply know that that's not true. It's really important to involve communities, from educators, the learners, parents, community leaders, into the design process to really unpack how that technology should be applied and what changes are required. This is true also when you think about digital education resources and content. And so I'm very impressed with the efforts that partners have been making within this space, and especially with the recent experiences within COVID, to really make it a community-led design process. And so I know you're going to have a rich conversation ahead of time, and just to say, I think this is a very timely discussion. So very much thank you to Xavier Project and to M-Shule for kicking off this very vital discussion.
According to UNHCR, there are 82.4 million forcibly displaced people worldwide at the end of 2020 as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violation, or events that seriously disturbing public order. Of these, 26.4 million are refugees. Conflict-affected, marginalized, and underserving communities often do not have access to resources that support and empower them and their families as they navigate through crisis. The theme of the 2021 World Refugee Day was Together We Learn, Heal, and Shine, aiming to focus on access to healthcare, education, and creativity to support refugees build better futures. In our talk today, we focus on the second pillar of this year's theme, Learn. How can we protect and improve the lives of refugees every single day through education? The panelists today represent organizations that have each worked among and with refugees in different capacities to reduce the gap in accessing appropriate education opportunities and encourage engagement. We will briefly introduce ourselves and the organizations we work for. As I said in the beginning, I work with M-Shule, the first personalized knowledge building platform in Africa to connect learners to tailored learning, education, activation, and data tools over SMS. Meaning mobile school in Kiswahili, M-Shule combines SMS with artificial intelligence to reach offline or marginalized communities with self-paced, interactive, and personalized resources to power the success. Organizations leverage this award-winning approach to help individuals learn new skills, evaluate their progress, activate them to new behaviors, and most importantly, collect and analyze data in their progress. By making an all-in-one skill building platform possible with the simplest feature phone, M-Shule unlocks new opportunities for millions of learners across sub-Saharan Africa and the world. Next, I will invite my fellow panelists, Rebecca and Edmund, to tell us about their organizations, OSUN and Xavier Project, respectively. Rebecca?
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you, Claire, for inviting me to be here today. I'm Rebecca Granato, and I work for Bard College as the Associate Vice President for Global Initiatives. And I also have an Open Society University Network role. Bard College is one of the co-founders of the OSUN Network, along with the Central European University. And in my OSUN capacity, I direct what are called the Hubs for Connected Learning Initiatives, which I'll reference as the panel goes on. So just briefly, OSUN's mission in places like East Africa and Jordan and Bangladesh and around the world is to forge deep and global partnerships and to connect deeply and productively with local communities. So really this tension of local and global is something we think a lot about. And in refugee education, we are operating these hubs that do tertiary education, teacher training, and also offer research opportunities in Jordan and the MENA region, in Kenya and East Africa, and then soon to be in Bangladesh. So thank you, Phoebe.
Yes, thank you, Phoebe and M-Shule. It's a great honor to be here. I'm Edmund Page from Xavier Project, and Xavier Project initially began as an education NGO working with refugees. And so all of our background is in education, and we still do a lot of work in education. Over time, we have come to work with refugee leaders, particularly refugee-led organizations, supporting them in their own missions and their own vision. We do less direct implementation now, and we're trying to do as much as possible, if not exclusively work through refugee-led initiatives. But partly because of our education background, we have really strong partnerships with refugee-led organizations who are working in education in all sorts of educational activities. And so we still have a strong link with that, although some of the refugee-led organizations or RLO partners we work with are also working in other areas as well. So it's a privilege to be here because looking forward to talking about that overlap between education and refugee-led initiatives today.
Thank you for that, Rebecca and Michael. And we have all mentioned something that Jackie also talked about, that it is essential to take into account the context within which we implement solutions so that we have tailored interventions. And this is also a learning we have picked up in the course of implementing programs. The need for refugee-specific programming with the goal of offering appropriate and acceptable resources that are not only accessible, but also affordable. I think for us, any product or set of content that we work on, we typically conduct user survey interviews to ensure that whatever we are working on is not only appropriate, but also acceptable right from the start. What's your experience been when it comes to working with refugee learners and communities in creating educational resources that are contextualized for them?
Phoebe, would you like me to start? Sorry, you
Yes,
broke
please.
up for a second there. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good question, and one that we, of course, like everyone on this call, think a lot about. One of the things that with the OSUN programming that we give a lot of thought to is this kind of, I guess you could say, this tension between creating programming for refugee learners and also offering educational opportunities that can be open to refugee learners. So what do I mean by that? I guess, one of the things we struggle with and grapple with in the hubs is trying to strike a balance between offering our learners an authentic university classroom, for example, so that they really feel like they're having a university experience, if that's the level that they're entering into, if they're at the tertiary level, but also ensuring that they're prepared for that experience. So for example, until recently, OSUN was offering all of our courses so that refugee learners in places like Kakuma, Dadaab, Zatari, Azraq, wherever in the world, that they might be coming in to blended classrooms with matriculated OSUN students who are students at institutions getting degrees, whereas our students would be coming in to take courses as they proceed down the path for a certificate. The students like this. They like the feeling that they're in a university classroom, but that isn't always the best for them. What we've found is that they're often not actually prepared at the level that they need to be in order to enter into those classrooms and be successful and to really get what they need out of it. So in terms of kind of the responsive, I guess you could say, our responsiveness and seeking student and refugee learner input into what kind of educational opportunity they really want, although that's what they're seeking is a university experience. What we've tried to think about is the ways that we can bridge that university classroom experience with the contextualized needs of the students, with a greater level of preparation. And one of our challenges in doing that has been also in these contexts to preserve the very high-touch student-centered approach that operates in our normal university classrooms, and to ensure that that is the case in a low-resource setting, and also one where the learners are not with other matriculated students. So through many different iterations of programs over the years, one of the solutions we've come up with is a kind of bridging, a sort of bridging approach for students. And I think a lot of partners in the field are looking in this direction. So a bridging program that allows students to enter into university faculty-led classrooms, blended in format where there's synchronous elements where the faculty are teaching, but also asynchronous elements where the students are together in a space and experiencing their own kind of university classroom, but at the same time doing it at a slower pace. So maybe the credit accumulation is slower. Perhaps the skills that we're focusing on are slightly different than they would be in a university classroom with matriculated students. So taking students through a kind of more systematic curriculum that is still faculty-led and faculty designed. I know we're going to talk later about the role of RLOs, but certainly I'll just say here that RLOs are important in this kind of model because it's the RLOs that provide the facilitators who can still be trained by the faculty at a university, but the facilitators are really the people on the ground continuing to constantly iterate, reflect, and adapt the content and make sure that it's fully contextualized for the learners. So that's, I think, one of the tensions that we're constantly grappling with in OSUN is this notion of programming that's just for refugees and programming that is open to refugees and provides the same quality of education and access, but also has a level of contextualization that might allow students to grow and progress at the rate that they really need to be successful. I don't know if Edmund wants to add something. I can say more. But...
Yeah, sure. Well, I think what you've described there, Rebecca, also matches with what Jackie was saying in her introduction about the design process and being flexible and adaptable. I think when working on refugee-specific programs and interventions, you really can't make any assumptions before you go in. And unfortunately, I have seen examples where ideas come from outside, and it's assumed that because it works in other areas of the world, in other contexts, that it must work in a refugee context. And sometimes all the ingredients are there to make it sound really plausible that it's going to work, and then it might still not work. And that's definitely not because refugees aren't desperate to learn, to access education. It's just because there are factors that refugees experience that it can be quite hard to fully comprehend, especially if you're not used to working in that context, or even if you are. And that could be for all sorts of reasons, but to give a few examples, things to do with relevance of the content and how long refugees expect to be in the hosting country, things to do with infrastructure and whether they really have infrastructure to access what's being offered, things to do with priorities as well for them, thinking about, you know, in the refugee hosting contexts in Kenya, huge proportions of refugee families in both Kakuma and Dadaab are making do with, you know, one meal a day, you know. So what are the priorities for basic needs at that point? That's not to say that education and programs can't work and be really successful, but it won't work unless the process of design is collaborative. I even wonder if participation goes far enough. Because I think sometimes people think of the word participation as being a nice way to include others in the design, but actually it really needs to be led. And so that idea of participation, it's got to be the most extreme, you know, levels of participation, because it just won't really work unless everyone involved has got a creative role in the design of the program. I think the way to get around this when you're going into it is to be flexible, to be ready to adapt, which clearly OSUN, you know, is a good example of that. Not just because of the context, but also the unpredictability. And you look at, you know, the two contexts I'm used to in Kenya and Uganda, there can be rapid changes in what may be due to a huge influx of refugees, or other cases, as we've seen in Kenya in two occasions, like huge hosting areas, either urban or camps, having an uncertain future of how long they're going to be in the same setup. So I mean, that's another factor as well that will impact the refugee take-up and engagement with activity when there's so little assurance or predictability of even where they're going to be in 6 months' time. So I think, in summary, just being flexible, adaptable, and open is vital.
Yeah, that is absolutely wonderful, and I'm pretty sure that, especially taking into account the fact that COVID also messed things up. In terms of, there are certain things that different programs are working on and adapting in terms of to ensure that the different programs that we lead are successful. But even so, noting that whatever the case, whatever happens, we have to be flexible in terms of our approaches, in terms of whatever it is that we are putting in and sending out to have the optimal outputs, and also just success of the program as well. One of the things that Rebecca talked about was working with or through refugee-led organizations. I think when it comes to participation, also ownership of this, as also you have mentioned, in terms of ensuring that we include the different categories right from the start and in the highest levels. In your experience, Rebecca, how you've seen the role of refugee-led organizations change and grow during COVID-19?
Well, I mean, certainly the major impact of COVID has been the lack of movement. And this is for all of us, not just in refugee contexts, of course. I mean, as we all sit here working from our homes, surrounded by cats and children, we've all experienced this limitation in movement. I mean, I think that it's a good move in some ways, a silver lining, if you will, that refugee-led organizations and community-based organizations could take more of a role on the ground in actually the implementation. I mean, I know that in our case, because our programming is all blended, we really want our students gathering together. And of course, there were limitations on that during COVID, but there were also moments even early on in the pandemic where students could come back together in, socially distanced ways, but our faculty and our administration and our staff couldn't travel. So refugee-led organizations took on more of a role in training facilitators, in supporting the students on the ground, in helping students feed back into the programming and kind of articulate what is working, what isn't working. And I see this as, I mean, Edmund can speak more about this, but it seems like this is probably a pretty permanent shift, that there will be increasingly a more ever-present position of the refugee-led organizations in a lot of the kind of international programming that's happening inside camps.
Yes, I think it has been exciting since 2020 to see the emergence of or actually the recognition of the work that RLOs have been doing in education as well as other sectors. I think it's important to note that it was all bubbling away behind the scenes for a long time, and it was 2020 was when it finally the light was shone on the important role refugee leaders were playing. And that's led to RLOs receiving more support, which is coming through, although it's still a tiny fraction of the entire humanitarian aid infrastructure and budget and so on. But it is increasing, which is exciting. And from that, there's also an emergence of new RLOs coming through, young leaders or leaders with a lot of experience, including technical experience in education, who can innovate even more within their communities. So I think everything's moving in the right direction, but we need to all advocate to do more. I can talk a bit more about that, but I think one of the reasons that working through refugee-led organizations or any other kind of refugee-led initiative, there are various reasons why it's a good way of working. In our experience, it's far more sustainable. It's probably one of the only ways I can think of where a larger organization can completely step away with almost no contact with the program, and it can still sustain and continue and grow with its own creativity. It's more effective and cost efficient as well, as we've done some small studies on that to show cost effectiveness of and basically better use, more efficient use of resources by people on the ground. And of course, it's a more appropriate way of working because it affords dignity to a population whose dignity has been suppressed by the experience of forced displacement. To achieve this, I think the most important thing at the moment, there's a lot of focus on resources, financial resources, and transferring resources to refugee-led organizations, which is important, and so is the focus on capacity strengthening and coordination. But I think the elements of ownership and agency on behalf of RLOs is vital to accept that the ideas coming from RLOs could be better than any other ideas, especially if there's a sharing of ideas amongst RLO networks, etc. And I think where this is relevant for education initiatives, including EdTech initiatives, is really trying to think how can an idea or a solution that has in some ways been crafted anywhere in the world be owned and have ownership transferred to refugee leaders. And I don't think there's obvious, easy answers, but it is possible. And I think it's just thinking about what are the motives, what are the very broad spectrum of motives of RLOs in all of these activities. Clearly, impact for their participants, the children they're working with, is their number one. But there are other motives in terms of their long-term sustainability as organizations and their growth, their organizational growth, which need to be considered. And then I think having the flexibility again for them to adapt the program to the community's needs. And I think the best way to do that is just to openly ask, how would you adapt this to your community? And that in terms of a few ideas of how this has worked, we've even asked for pitches where groups might pitch their idea and have a bit of an idea sharing platform where different ideas are looked at in the community, in a group, collaboratively, and so on. So that way, if their idea then goes through, then that sense of ownership is increased because it's very clear that it hasn't just come from above, like this is how it should be implemented. And I think in any program, even one like M-Shule, the same can apply. So just thinking through really what does that transfer of ownership mean beyond just providing resources is one of the ways that we can accelerate this shift towards refugee-led initiatives.
Can I add some? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure thing.
I was going to add something that is perhaps a little bit kind of building on something that Edmund said about, transfer of ownership to refugee-led organizations, but also I think transfer of ownership to, as part of working with refugee-led organizations, but to students as well, of their own educational process. And this is something that I think also maybe gets a little bit at this question that was raised in the chat by one of the Claires about overcoming some of these tech challenges and, trying to support things like digital learning and inclusion for refugees. I would say that one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about as faculty and as program administrators is how to transfer the ownership of the classroom setting to refugees themselves, in the sense that not only do we actively promote learner-centered approaches, but also we emphasize process. And I think the more faculty, in my experience, the more faculty can emphasize process with students, and the fact that perhaps in a digital environment, in some cases, the faculty and the students are all learning how to overcome some of the tech challenges together, how to best convey material technologically, especially when you're talking about synchronous and blended classrooms. And that if the students can kind of own that process, it sort of transfers ownership to them of the classroom, that they are part of the creation of the space along with the faculty member. It isn't just the faculty member telling them what they need to know. It's not just a content-driven conversation, but a process-driven conversation. And I think this is something that's particularly challenging in these environments because, of course, students, and students globally, it's not just in refugee settings, they're thinking about the end game, the degree. And it's a constant kind of pulling back pedagogically and thinking about how to encourage process, learning together, grappling with challenges, turning classrooms, whether they're online or in person, into kind of workshop settings. And I think this is also how we encourage digital learning and inclusion of our refugee learners into our process too. I don't know if that helped answer the question in the chat a little bit.
Yeah, and I think I'll also just add something as well. I had mentioned that for us, for anything that we work on, we typically conduct user survey interviews so that we understand what it is that we want, so that we understand the needs of the particular community, and the solutions that are developed are also appropriate and acceptable right from the start. Not only do we do this, but we also ensure that we have diverse representation right from that particular stage, the user research stage, and through to the pool of users and the team that will work on the product development. So in our engagement with refugees, the one thing that we also do is that we ensure that we build upon existing community structures. It is easier to introduce a solution or to work on a solution that the community can place in the structures or in the setup that they already have. And one of the things that we have done is work through community-based and refugee-led organizations, where we have supported both adults and young learners. So understanding that this is critical, that this is important, that the solution comes in to meet the communities that we want to support and work with right at their points of need. And I think even leading off on that, one of the things that, again, all of us have talked about is the innovations or the things that we have worked as far as involving refugee stakeholders is concerned. Are there particular results that you would want to highlight when you took on this approach, what you saw, especially working and looking at sustainability, looking at ownership? Are there things that you would want to advocate for example, Rebecca?
Sure, thank you. So I would say that one of the things we've noted, and this is getting away from tertiary ed, but moving into a different realm of education, which is professional development for teachers who are working in particularly camp-based settings. And, you know, I think there's a similar tension to the one that I referenced earlier in relation to tertiary learners, in that when you're tailoring professional development for teachers who, for them, this may also be their exposure to a kind of tertiary educational opportunity, because most of the teachers in these camp-based settings, if they're refugees themselves, don't have any undergraduate training, is the tension between when to privilege what we might call universal best practices, and also adaptations that take into account the reality on the ground, like overcrowded classrooms, the reality of untrained incentive teachers, often the use of informal curricula, such as in the Bangladesh setting. And all of this tends to lead to attrition of these incentive teachers, or maybe they're not even incentive teachers. Maybe they're hired by a ministry, but still they don't have the proper qualifications and training. And one of the solutions we've come up with is to adapt work that we've been doing in many different contexts that I guess you could say valorizes the teaching profession, encourages the refugee teachers to embrace their learning as a teacher as they would any other kind of educational experience, to work on improving their practice, but also to become reflective practitioners who can engage in things like classroom-based research, and that they themselves become not only situated to improve as teachers, but also they're kind of feeding back into their own practice and the practice of their community of teachers that they become part of as they're learning and professionalizing themselves. So that's something that we have found to be successful in a number of contexts, that invites, again, an emphasis on process amongst the refugees themselves, and also high levels of participation in thinking about the direction that pedagogical practice should be going based on what's happening inside the classroom. So they themselves are learners and researchers and reiterators, I guess you could say. So that's one example.
Yeah, I like that example, Rebecca, because it's quite similar to something that we do, but with less of a pedagogical focus, more on organizational capacity for refugee leaders in terms of anything to do with strategic planning to governance, finance processes, etc., and to try and inculcate that, that sense of always moving forward and growing and learning. And one of the, we have a capacity strengthening and sharing course, partly called sharing because we've also learned just as much from the process. And one of the modules focuses on community feedback and community engagement, which I think touches on your previous points about the end users also being involved in the design of activities. And that's quite an early stage module for us. So it's really important, even in designing organizational strategies, that it's really the RLO management with the community that design those strategies. When it comes to educational activities and initiatives that have worked, I think one of the things that have been quite consistent for us is the creation of a physical space. It's not a requirement or something that we must do in every partnership with RLOs. We have currently about 18 comprehensive partnerships, but a significant number of those we've helped get to the point of having a physical space. When it comes to even EdTech being involved in that, what we found is that just having one space with quite good connectivity can then enable that RLO to host multiple initiatives based on what they really want to do. And something like M-Shule could be a good example. And we've supported RLOs with numerous others in the past. It tends to be relatively easy compared to other things, although not easy, to fundraise for connectivity infrastructure. And the good thing is that might then last for a couple of years before needing to be renovated. And that can, so once the infrastructure is in place, an RLO can actually reach a large number of children or young adults or even adults in education initiatives through that initial investment, so to speak. And I also just want to bring in the vital focus of transitioning formal education into national systems, which is a kind of global advocacy area that UNHCR is leading on along with partners, and I think it's working well, although gradually. And I think it's important to say that in some cases it might not seem obvious how RLOs overlap with that delivery of formal education, particularly for children under, at primary and secondary levels. But there are loads of examples of RLOs contributing to that process and supporting formal systems, which I think is very important, especially now where, say, in Kenya and Uganda, you still have examples of 200 children in one classroom with under-supported, in some cases, teachers who haven't undergone a huge amount of training. And so the amount of support that RLOs can provide to that system, everything from the pathways through ECD, reaching the most vulnerable, helping them to access formal schooling, the peripheral extracurricular activities, which can be run maybe on compound or alongside, which can really boost even the academic attainment. But then outside of all the things when students drop out, incentivizing education to just try to keep children learning as long as possible, building that link vocational to livelihoods, and also within the formal system holding schools to account through parent-teacher associations, boards of governors, advising on safety elements because they really understand the community. So when thinking about what works, what can work, because I think this is still an underexplored area, we don't need to completely separate this idea of transitioning formal education into national systems with the growth of refugee-led organizations.
Yeah, and it's good that you have started also just touching on sustainability and longevity of the interventions that that we offer. Because one of the issues that also Rebecca has mentioned that is the shortage of qualified teachers. The recommended ratio in Kenya is 1:40. And the German Development Bank in 2012 noted that Kakuma had a ratio of 169, Dadaab had a ratio of 159, and that was compared to the then national average of 1:58. So this means that essentially teachers are overworked, and some students may fall through the cracks as a result of this. And one of the things that as M-Shule we are doing is working on a teacher toolkit. And again, emphasis being on how can we make it easier for teachers to work, for teachers to support different communities, for teachers to also get to a place where they are able to work confidently. And we hope that with this tool, teachers will be helped to develop lesson plans, will also access content for professional development and make it easier for them to even prepare assessments and evaluations for learner. So coming up with a system that makes it easier for the volunteers or the different people that have been posted there who may not be receiving the support they have, the support that is necessary for them to carry out their duties as appropriate. And so with this in mind, the other thing that has also been mentioned is that we can continue, we have addressed how we can continue supporting different refugee learners through the duration of whatever program they are undertaking, and that to ensure that by the end of it, all their skills and abilities are maximized. But what systems and structures do we have in place once they cross the finish line? So say for primary school learners, are they able to access secondary school EdTech resources when they transition, as Edmund was talking about? What are the long-term considerations for collaborative engagement with refugees that we need to have to promote sustainable change? What is the future of sustainable refugee education? I'll start with you, Edmund.
Well, I think in terms of the future of refugee-led innovations, I mean, as I was just saying, I think, I hope this trend of transitioning in an education, refugee education to formal systems continues. There's still a huge amount to do, and I think it's in everyone's interest, including hosting governments, for that to happen. But if we're to see a continued growth in the role of RLOs in education, be it with supporting the formal system or in all the many supportive elements that even branch out into other sectors, such as social, emotional, psychosocial, mental health, livelihoods, child protection as well, which all, you know, is so vital to supporting the education systems. I think there's a few things that need to happen, but I think one is for people to be much more ambitious in the way that they imagine the role of refugee-led organizations. When you think that at the moment, RLOs receive about 0.5% of humanitarian funding. That's in East Africa, where RLOs have, you know, a relatively larger presence than in other parts of the world. And also, just the numbers of RLOs that are coming through is impressive, but compared to the population of refugees, even between the two countries, I think we're going to see a huge growth in the number of RLOs, the capacity of RLOs to achieve impact, and the reach that they achieve in their work, and consequently the much more significant role that they're going to play in the entire humanitarian response, which might become more and more vital if current trends, you know, continue, trends that are a bit concerning, such as the continued growth in the number of displaced people around the world, and a trend that's really began in 2019 of budgets, total humanitarian budgets actually going down, meaning that the deficit is growing exponentially. So new ways of working are going to be vital. So if we can completely reimagine the proportion of activities and interventions and initiatives that are led by refugees, I think it could be quite a different picture in 5 years' time, and that's what I hope to see. But aside from imagining it, we also have to think about the how. And one of just to give briefly, I think a couple of examples would be continued coordination between refugee-led organizations, including refugee-led networks, refugee-led capacity strengthening, and not just capacity strengthening being led by INGOs, as well as completely different formats of channeling funding to RLOs, including examples that are coming up now, such as coalitions of RLOs working together to receive direct funding. So some of these initiatives are in the early stages, and that they need to be supported over the next few years.
And I'm not sure how much I have to add to what Edmund said. I mean, that was a really comprehensive answer. But I think also empowering RLOs, and possibly through consortia, to really imagine and affect actual structural change. I mean, looking at, for example, since we were just talking about, teacher communities and incentive teachers in places like Kakuma, thinking about ways to empower the RLOs to really encourage teachers to forge their own community of practice that might have real power, have power to create a kind of structure within that community where there are trainers built into that community rather than trainers coming from outside, from INGOs. But I think that change needs to be driven from within. I mean, because it would involve structural change as well, since in many cases, the trainings, just as an example, are one-off trainings led by this partner or that partner. But if an RLO is taking a lead there, they can work directly with the teachers to kind of forge a new structure within the environment that would allow them to really take the leadership on creating their own governance as well. So, yeah, I mean, that's just to kind of emphasize some of what Edmund is saying.
So essentially, as we are doing this, different organizations and also CBOs, RLOs working with communities need to be aware of the need to identify an approach that is sustainable. If it means working within the structures, if it means also just collaborating with experts as well, I think even coming up with sustainable models is something that that would make a difference. I can see that I don't know whether Claire, there's any question that we might have missed out on the chat, because I want to believe that the panelists addressed this as we were going on.
I think there's, hi everyone. I think there's one great question here from Mike that has reflected what we were just speaking about, which is how can we work with refugee-led organizations to help them, take on these structural challenges and changes while they're working in a very financially or resource-deprived context, which sometimes leads them, justifiably to prioritize some of these short-term projects. So any guidance or any great ideas around that, I think would be great to hear.
Yeah. So thanks for highlighting that, Claire. I think I would like to ask whether Edmund and Rebecca, you have anything to add on that. I know one of the things that I have mentioned, and I think I would like to emphasize on is yes, we are aware that for especially right now with everything that is going on, that funding runs out. So programs need to be supported by experts on different matters. And one of the ways that would be finding sustainable models. We have seen this work for different organizations. An additional approach would also be working on building offline relationships with community gatekeepers to ensure the longevity of some of these programs and to have them as self-sustainable. That's what I can think of right now.
I mean, it's certainly, you know, the direction that donors are taking certainly could be kind of utilized and interpreted in order to focus more on long-term needs. I mean, with sort of localization efforts, and localization could be read, of course, as RLOs, that if more money is going to those organizations, then it's up to the donors as well to contribute to helping encourage that agenda, I think, and encouraging less of a project by project approach and promoting RLOs really taking a lead on developing the agenda from within.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that while RLO leaders are very committed to their work, they also have to support their own livelihoods. And I still see too many examples where refugee leaders are expected to work long hours as volunteers to support, you know, initiatives, particularly if it's within a program that's fully funded. I don't think that should be happening anymore. I think, you know, traditional funding models have cumbersome reporting and accountability structures that can end up taking creative time away from RLOs, and I think that could change. That could be done more efficiently. Yeah. Overall, for a donor, I mean, a way to get around this short-term focus is to support organizational sustainability. That might be in the form of supporting in leadership roles, etc., rather than insisting that all budget lines must go on immediate outputs. So I think a lot of the responsibility comes from funding communities, and in the end it will be that will lead to sustainability and more efficient funding models as well. And overall, just to work with refugee leaders in terms of organizational capacity to build those long-term strategies that can also be collectively designed and yeah, based on good governance systems, etc.
Yeah, thanks for those additions, Rebecca and Edmund. Now, unfortunately, due to time constraints, we may not be able to address other questions here in this session, but we will certainly follow up with our responses after the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. We will summarize again, as I have mentioned, send this as well as the recording and contact information for our speakers organizations. So in case there's anything else that you want to add in the next 1 minute, you can put that in the chat. And thank you very much again to Rebecca and Edmund for your involvement in this session, and to our coordinator, Claire.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.